Good morning. Good morning, all of you, participants, attendees, students, researchers, and a very good morning to our director, Professor Dr. Meenakshi Jain, convener Dr. Adnaran, and organizing secretary, Professor Dr. Abdul Razak. We would be starting day 2 now, and we have the honor to have a distinguished academician as our keynote speaker today morning, and that is Dr. Louis Rice from United Kingdom, and he's there with us online. Welcome, Dr. Rice. Are you able to see and hear us?
Yes, I can hear
you. Just a second, we'll put your screen on also. So we will be starting the keynote today. I will take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Rice. Dr. Louis Rice is the head of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Healthy Urban Environment at the University of West England, Bristol. He's an architect, urban designer, and a professor specializing in architecture and urban design for health and well-being. Dr. Rice studied architecture from Sheffield University and then worked as an architect and urban designer for over a decade in London and Paris. He joined UWE as a research fellow as a part of the World Health Organization project, and thereby rose up to become one of the key faculty members of the department, handling the Masters in Urban Design program for several years. He's the author of numerous books and articles on architecture and urban design, and is the lead module teacher for the final year of Masters in Architecture. His areas of expertise and interest is architecture and health, healthy urban design, spatial determinants of well-being. And we also have the privilege to mention that he has been one of our active members for the shortlisting and the scrutiny committee for the various technical papers. We thank you a lot for your, and also the fact that it must be very, very early morning there in United Kingdom, and thank you for being with us. This session is also getting live streamed in YouTube, so many of our participants are watching via YouTube. So over to you for the start of the keynote.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen as well, just check that's working. Can you see that okay, my screen?
I can see the screen. Please go ahead.
Great. Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is very early here. It's also snowing here, so it's very different temperature. But thank you very much. Yes, so I am a professor in architecture and healthy urban environments over in the UK. I'm delighted to give you a presentation today at this conference. I work for the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Healthy Urban Environments, and I've been head of that for a number of years now, and I've been working with that center for over a decade, looking broadly at how the built environment, the design and planning of built environment can help to contribute to better health and well-being for both humans and also kind of planetary health as well. So it's got a sustainability as well as a human well-being aspect. And today I want to be talking about a kind of an overview of the research I do in a kind of holistic way. So not one specific project particularly, but bringing those all together to see how urban planning can lead towards healthier and sustainable cities, and also how we can unite public health, urban planning and architecture at those scales and trying to integrate those. The talk today, I'll just run through. First of all, I'll set out how health and the built environment are connected and what the relationships are, before looking at what are the health issues that we're facing today and what we're likely to be facing in the next few decades as well. So we kind of know what we're kind of fighting against. They're setting out the connection between health and sustainability, and then moving into what we call expanding the public health workforce. So it's a very new thing that's just emerging in the context I work in, and that's bringing together urban planning and architecture and those professions with kind of public health and the medical sector as well. And then towards the end, move into more focus on healthy architecture. So again, trying to integrate all that thinking together before drawing conclusions. So the first section is about health in the built environment. What do we know? What don't we know? What's the kind of state of play? And first of all, it's just an example of a fairly typical city. And what does it show us? It's predicated on roads. So we can see a big major highway running through the city with lots of cars, lots of very modern development, lots of new glass buildings. And this is bringing lots and lots of benefits, lots of economic benefits and lots of private and individual benefits. And lots of good sanitation quite often, but there are also problems created with this as well. So obviously air pollution, we can actually see it, but most of the time there is air pollution in most cities, even if we can't see it, often caused by traffic, but also kind of burning of fuels as well. Obviously noise pollution, obviously in that image we can see there's lots of traffic, so there's a lot of noise pollution as well, which affects things like sleep and leads to other kind of health issues as well. As we can see, also lots of sedentary lifestyle, so either sitting in a car or like we're all today, sat on our backsides, working all day long, and particularly under COVID, the being stuck at home and not having to kind of commute so much from much of the world's population is contributing to that sedentary lifestyle. And then lastly, mental health issues. There's lots of stresses of the built environment, which are also contributing to health. So along with the positives that we're creating with kind of newer and cities, there's also lots of health disbenefits as well. I'm not trying to point the, I think the last image was of a city in China, but it's not trying to point the finger at any particular place. This image that we have shows how homogeneous the world is. So if I took the names off the slide, it'd be very hard to tell which city we're looking at. So regardless of climate or context or cultures, most cities now are developing really, really similarly. In fact, if you go to the city centre of many cities worldwide, they're very, very similar. So one of the positives is that if we find solutions, they're very likely to work in most urban contexts as well. And we know how important that is. This graph here shows the world is already, I'm sure you already know this, the world's already mostly urban. And we can see what a massive transformation this has been over the last over 100 years. So from 1950, where only 10% of the world's population lives in urban settings, by 2050, that's more like 70%. So if we can fix urban, make cities healthier, we can really, really address health for a large proportion of the world's population. And we can see we need to do it rapidly as well, because that growth is really, really increasing over the next few decades. And we've lots of technologies have contributed to that. So this image shows obviously the development of cars and car parking, a car-based economy and a car-based culture. We also see buildings that are maybe bigger or allow forms of architecture that never happened before, with mechanical ventilation and mechanical lighting, allowing new forms of technology. Creating spaces such as these, so on the one side is a shopping mall, so huge interior space, the other is a casino. So it affords quite amazing spaces and new forms of spaces that historically we've never managed to achieve. But there's a big question about, are they good for us? So that's still a bit of an open question about some of the disbenefits to our health as well. And we'll explore that and unpick that throughout this talk. We know as well that society spends over 90% of its time indoors, and that figure is actually higher for some cultures and some economies. And we know under COVID, that figure over the last year has been even higher, sometimes closer to 100% of time indoors. At least what Peter Sloterdijk calls connected isolation. So we're living nearer and nearer each other, and we're much more connected, but also isolations occurring. So although we're living near each other in maybe apartments or in cities, we're not necessarily more connected. So there's a kind of social fabric breakdown compared to some communities as well. And this kind of indoorization process is also causing big impacts because we're kind of breaking our relationship with nature as well. So that's a relatively new phenomenon at this scale. Any talk on health, healthy cities? Obviously, you've got to mention COVID. We're living in very, very unusual times indeed. But it's interesting to reflect on how architecture and this planning of cities is also being used as one of the primary tools against COVID. So we're using the built environment for quarantine. Historically, they tended to be separate from the city, but this current pandemic has really led to the city itself being led, or the built environment as the primary quarantine location as well. So we still see very clearly that relationship between the use of the built environment and as a kind of health tool as well. There's huge disparities and huge spatial inequalities emerging as well. This very famous image now shows on the one side an informal city, which is growing more rapidly than formal cities globally, where there's often relatively either unsanitary or unsafe housing. Whilst there's sometimes quite a lot of positives to those, there's also disbenefits as well. But next to it is a formal city and a very, very luxurious place to live, but it's got more greenery, health facilities, sports facilities, very nice apartments. And we see a polarization almost, and pulling apart, rather than kind of leveling up, as we might say, a huge set of inequalities emerging in cities. It's not often always quite so visible as that, but we need to improve, reduce that level of inequality in order to provide healthier cities for all. There's lots of work already done, and there's lots of work emerging that's really helpful. So this was done by the Building Research Establishment, and it's trying to set out evidence-based causeways. So before there were lots of hypothesized relationships, but there's becoming more clear evidence-based, and I think that's really important, connecting medical level evidence, data that doctors and the medical profession will accept, and connecting that back to the design of the built environment. And here we see on the left hand, on my left hand side, the urban environment exposures. So things like car-centric design, air pollution, flooding, urban heat island effect, and how those built environment conditions lead in very complicated ways, sometimes through direct exposure, indirect effects, behavioral outcomes, to those health outcomes again. So there's really good evidence now to link back and saying, if we design in a particular way, if we provide this kind of built environment, these will be the health outcomes that you need to address, which is also useful to knowing for a particular population, if you have a high level of respiratory disease or cardiovascular disease, you can also work backwards and say, well, actually, these are the built environment conditions that we need to address as well. So it can work both ways. There's also more evidence emerging as well, more practice and policy level guidance that's coming through. So here again, on the left, things like planning principles. So how planners who may be urban planners who are maybe who are experts in planning but aren't experts in public health can learn to provide a policy context in which this healthy outcomes can emerge as well. So again, it's very good evidence connecting these, which is really helpful for an evidence-based policy context as well. The previous images slides were more about very broad urban planning approaches and ideas. And then as we work through as well, there's things like kind of, let's say, urban design and the scale of smaller spaces, so smaller scale as well. And this is very helpful, this ladder of place quality, this kind of approach, the kind of red light and green light. So red light, stop and avoid, and green light, let's go for it. And this graph or this image is very helpful because it's got the evidence base as well. So really strong evidence. So it's a really good case for the connection between, for example, car-dependent development and very poor health outcomes. And more positively, really good evidence for high levels of greenness and health. And in between, there's less evidence or there's less strong evidence. It's helpful as well because then we can start addressing trying to develop better evidence base for that to know whether to avoid or beware of it. But we're a long way away. So just from a UK context, we've got a built environment context that's still a lot to improve. So in the UK, 1 in 3 homes are so poor shouldn't have been given planning permission, which is a very, very high level as well. Poor housing alone costs a huge amount of money the year to the NHS, which is the National Health Service in the UK. A very poor level of walkability to public transport, and even lower to services such as shops or doctors or schools as well. So high levels of car-centric design built into those as well. And even now, the regulations are still very poor. For example, you can still build housing without any windows at all, which is a really poor level of design to expect families to grow up in as well. And we see this is across some of the EU nations, really relatively high levels of people living in poor conditions. So in the UK, about one in 5 homes don't meet what we call a decent home standard. So we would expect poor health outcomes to come out from that. And we can see a range of different countries there across the EU where most countries are doing not that well, with a large proportion of the population living in conditions that would contribute to poor health. So we've got a long way to go and improve that condition. And it's important to know as well what health issues we need to address, because a broad area, it changes with sometimes from city to city and from country to country, and to get that better idea. Firstly is what we call non-communicable diseases, or NCDs, sometimes called lifestyle diseases. And this is from the World Health Organization. So we see over half of all deaths globally are caused by what we call non-communicable diseases, or the lifestyle diseases. And that's particularly both troubling, but also an opportunity, because they're the most easily prevented and the most easily avoided as well. Through either relatively small changes in lifestyle, we could address those relatively easily. And if we break that down a bit more, we see that most of those deaths are cardiovascular diseases, often connected to the kind of food we eat and the kind of level of activity and exercise we do. And then other things like cancer and other kind of physical health issues. In the other category is kind of mental health, so depression and some of those issues as well. So a rising level of mental health issues. So at the moment, it's just over half of all deaths will be from non-communicable diseases. But as we see, as cities do clean up, we see that level rising to almost 80% in some countries. So, but the general trajectory is that the vast majority of all deaths will be from these lifestyle diseases. So they're avoidable, but they're really built in into the fabric of the city. And we can't afford them, basically. Over the next 20 years, those will cost over $30 trillion, or more importantly, about half of global GDP in 2010 figures. So we can't afford to have that level of illness as well. Just aside from the impacts on the individual and society of becoming ill and our families, there's the kind of economic imperative and argument that we need to pay attention to. And if we put that in a little more context there, across the EU, we roughly spend about 8 to 9% of gross domestic product on healthcare. So in the UK, that taxes go towards a kind of free healthcare. So the majority of the UK would have that. There's relatively low levels of private healthcare in the UK, but broadly it's about 8 or 9%. And it's expected roughly for that figure to almost double over the next 20 years, 20, 30 years or something. And we just can't afford it unless taxes increase hugely, which is politically unacceptable. We can't afford that. So we really need to address that. Here in the UK, I don't know whether you're aware, but our Prime Minister, when he got COVID, was hospitalised, and one of the contributing factors was his obesity. So it really changed his approach to that. So he's announced a kind of war on obesity in theory in the UK. No, there's not really any policy content to that yet because it's relatively new. But there's really changing attitudes from a kind of laissez-faire or approach to government being much more serious about targeting some of these things, and partly because of the cost as well. And what do we mean? I guess what are the communicable diseases? So here's some very kind of typical ones: depression, diabetes, high blood pressure, angina, obesity. And the size of the text there actually relates more to which problem is increasing rather than which are the major problems. And it's probably a little bit surprising that actually mental health issues are really increasing. But with most of these, it's very difficult to treat. We have a phrase: it's care, not cure. So for most of these, they can't be treated with a pill very easily. So things like depression, long term, we don't have a simple pill to fix that. It's not a quick operation and then you're recovered. Most of these require long-term care, and that's very, very expensive to give as well. So although they're easily prevented and avoided, once they emerge, they're very expensive and difficult to treat. And let's say Western medicine isn't very good at that yet as well. So there's a conundrum there for us to resolve. And mental health is really, really increasing. In the UK, 1 in 6 adults have a mental health problem at any one time. So that's a huge proportion of the population. And the World Health Organization estimates that by the end of this decade, it will be the leading cause of mortality and morbidity. So we really need to pay address to that. The image there is of one of the earliest asylums in the UK and globally to treat mental health, and luckily things have moved on from that. But it's still fair to say that most health systems don't treat mental health as well as physical health. We tend to be pretty good now at physical health, but we're still, it's a poor cousin often is a phrase used for mental health and the treatment, particularly in public health systems. And just as an example of that, this is diabetes treatments. And we have a number of different medicines showing the effect on blood, sugar, and weight. And at the end, I put there the wonder drug. And that wonder drug is physical activity. So it outperforms all of the medicines available. And it kind of shows how important it is to connect physical activity to health as well. And we have a real opportunity as planners and built environment professionals to help treat and also prevent some of these issues in the first place. Again, with the COVID-19 and what's called zoonosis, so the emergence of diseases from the animal world, the zoological world, into kind of human, so we've seen with COVID, obviously. And some of the pressures are things like deforestation and land use changes. So part of that is coming from urbanization. You can see in the image at the bottom there of cities kind of pushing into forests and other rich natural environments and displacing nature, which then comes into cities, increasing the chance of zoonosis. And there's an expectation that will happen more and with viruses more troublesome than COVID as well. So obviously we can see the huge impact. If I was doing this presentation a year ago, probably we wouldn't even have mentioned zoonosis as a particularly big issue, but moving forward, I think the world is now going to be addressing that more with a keener focus. The cost alone financially is estimated to be $28 trillion. So if we could invest that in better city planning as well, which will help contribute to that, a more sustainable development, downstream will be saving and paying for those benefits many times over. In England and the EU kind of healthy city network, this diagram has been really, really influential and one of the most cited publications, and it's by Dahlgren and Whitehead, and it tried to set out for policymakers and decision makers how to integrate decisions for health policy interventions across different scales and to kind of have joined up thinking, I guess. It's really helpful to use this diagram. When I was training as an architect, it was never mentioned to me, but with public health, it's almost the first thing, or one of the earliest things they'll learn about. And we need to become much more cognizant of this profession. And this diagram is really helpful. So to start to think through, from urban planning perspective, where we can intervene and where our profession can connect with that. So we have things like individual lifestyle factors and community and social networks. And then this other band called living and working conditions. And obviously, as architects and urban planners, we have a very close input to shaping living and working conditions. So we design buildings to live in and the cities, etc. So we really kind of have a direct impact on that. But also we frame a lot of those, so we can design cities that are more sociable, more convivial, more livable, which then frame social and community networks, and also impact on individual lifestyle factors. So of all the professions, we probably have more of a say in all of these aspects, directly and indirectly, than almost any other profession, probably even more than public health professionals as well. So this diagram is very helpful to us to show actually how important our role is in delivering healthier individuals and healthier societies as well. I'm sure you'll have seen this before, the World Health Organization. So I won't go into that again too much, but I guess the key thing for me is to also remember the multifaceted aspects of health as well. And also that it's a fundamental right of every human being. So again, we saw the image earlier of the huge spatial injustice, which highlights the social injustice. And we really need to reduce those within cities. The cities with higher levels of equality often have higher levels of health and well-being amongst that population. So it's a really a key issue. And this diagram is, I guess, it's just helpful to see how the determinants of health, of which we have really high input towards, refracted through that health lens. So thinking always of both physical, mental, and social health, and what those outcomes again, which are refracted and slightly different for individuals and different communities. If we break down a little bit more, what contributes to death? So again, so we need to know what health conditions we can really intervene in, and we reckon lifestyle is about 60% preventable or avoidable. So we can target that. The other aspects are probably outside of our control, but we have a big say in that. This developed in Canada, but the health fields again is another way of looking at it and how and kind of access into this field. So most money is on the medical healthcare system. So particularly in the UK, but most health services globally spend most of their money in the healthcare system. But it's really about solving a problem or treating a problem once it's already emerged. And a lot of the health problems that we see and that we are expecting to see over the next few decades aren't solvable with a pill and aren't really solvable with our healthcare system. So there's a real problem that we're building up at the moment, a challenge that we're seeing emerging. And then the two middle sections are about environment and lifestyle. So again, environment, we are the designers of that, so we can have a really big impact there. And on lifestyle, which is obviously connected to those as well. So we can really input a lot on aspects of that. It's probably helpful just to set out from a public health term. So in the UK, the public health is a public health professional is usually someone, or typically someone who's maybe did a degree in medicine, but rather than going on to become a GP or a doctor or a surgeon, they specialize in public health or population level health as well. So in the UK, it's quite a specific profession. It varies globally, so it might be somebody who isn't quite so medically trained, but who's dealing at how to improve the health more at a population or society level rather than an individual level. And they use these terms, obviously the treatment is quite clear, but prevention is about deterring the development of disease before it happens. Health promotion is more about trying to enable people to have control over their health as well. So there's a shift, particularly in public health, towards prevention and promotion. So that's seen where they can really get the best bang for their buck, I guess you might say. There's lots and lots of opportunities as well with new technologies coming in. I work with roboticists and artificial intelligence people as well, and there's incredible new opportunities to get data that's never been possible before. In fact, with things like wearable technologies, there's more data in the last 4 years than all of the data before that. So there's a huge wealth of information out there that we're still trying to work out how to have access to, how to kind of make sense of it as well. But there's loads of opportunities to connect all this evidence to really give us excellent database upon which to make these decisions, and also to track them in real time. So even maybe 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been possible to do some of these things. The next section looks at health and climate change. And we see a kind of nexus of related issues. So we have public health or sustainable design, healthy architecture, healthy cities. So we see a confluence of connected and overlapping issues, and in there's loads of real positive synergies that we can draw upon and where we could target to get best benefit as well. And we know that buildings, the built environment, make a huge amount of, or contribute a lot to climate change and the contributors to climate change as well. So we really need to address that. And one of the good things is that lots of the approaches to more sustainable design are also similar towards the solutions for kind of healthier populations as well. So there's a real win-win opportunity here. This sets out the kind of personal choices. The things like living car-free, it can have a really high impact, but obviously we can't do that with the design of certain cities as well. So it's not enough to just go with personal changes. We need to also have the design connected to that as well, so that people can make those choices and the cities kind of support that as well. There's also kind of much better data about how climate change is beginning to affect our cities and design and relate to the design of cities. So things like rising temperatures, obviously leading to things like heart stroke and cardiovascular problems as well. Very clear, obviously, extreme weather, things like flooding, leading to more death and injury and accident, and the rise of vector-borne diseases as well. And we see the greater prevalence of that, but it's quite interesting to see the environmental effects feeding through to health effects as well, and maybe some of the challenges we can start to address to reduce and break those connections. And we really need to, I guess, just to connect the professions. Urban planning has done more. I think some of the other ones, like architecture, could do more, and it's moving in that direction. There's a general trend towards more health-based sustainable development. We even see with the United Nations the shift from their Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. We see a big shift with health and well-being, much more of a focus on that term used much more. So there's a real integration now between healthy development and sustainable development to address climate change. One of the biggest changes I've seen is the connection between urban planning and urban architecture and the built environment professions, and connecting to what's being called the expanded public health workforce. So this sets out, which is quite a big, well, it's a huge change actually, a big paradigm shift emerging in those professions. I mean, when I trained as an architect, which is quite a few years ago now, it wasn't mentioned at all. So very little relationship between health, and when it was mentioned, it was about reducing accidents or injuries or health and safety at work, that kind of thing, but not more broadly lifestyle changes or non-communicable diseases. So that's really changed, and we're talking about that much more. There's much more focus about that I teach on urban planning and in architecture now, and it's right at the forefront of the agenda. The Royal Society for Public Health, which traditionally has a very tight focus on public health and a very kind of medical approach, have looked out to go, well, actually to solve some of these problems, to do health prevention, health promotion, we need to have a wider set of working with a wider set of professionals. So they looked at kind of built environment professions such as we are, interior designers, urban designers, architects, etc. And they said actually this is one of the biggest groups that they could work with and the most interest, but one of the least involved with the public health agenda. So we've got a huge opportunity there, and I think over the next decade or 2 decades, I think we're going to see a huge shift in the kind of medicalization of the architecture and urban planning professions. We're just beginning to see it in the UK, that shift, and I think it's becoming a global move towards it. I think Harvard has just set out, or recently set out, a master's in connecting urban design and public health, and I think we'll see more of those integrated masters and education processes that will lead to that demand, I guess, for that effect. In terms of preventing, and probably is on the next diagram. So this health pyramid is very familiar to planners, to public health, and this diagram tries to connect it and make sense of it for planners and built environment professions. And at the bottom, what they might call primary care in a health setting. It's about how to look after, how to kind of address the well population. That's a vast bulk of the population, which is why it's at the bottom of the pyramid. And that's about preventing disease before it happens, minimizing risk factors. So good ventilation and heating, walkability, those kind of factors. The next one is what they would call secondary care. And that's at people at risk of a health problem. So trying to screen for those, maybe retrofitting. So for example, my mother, who's quite elderly now, is at risk of fall. So her house, we're trying to put in things like handrails to reduce the risk of falling, etc. So we're retrofitting cities and houses to adapt to those users' needs before they get ill, but having more clear idea of what those problems are. And then at the top of the pyramid, so it's a much smaller part of the population, is people who have already developed that health problem, and then going back and again, sometimes retrofitting or changing the built environment to address those. So in the UK, for example, we have a very aging population, or a large aging population, and high levels of dementia. So we now have care facilities that are designed to try and help and support people with dementia. So that's a kind of 3-tiered way of maybe thinking about how we as designers can connect with those. There's also an emergence of how different health traditions and health beliefs globally also need to be thought about and integrated. So obviously India's got a long tradition of different health, as Ayurvedic and other traditions as well. which sit often alongside kind of, let's say, Western traditions. In some nations, for example, Ecuador, they have this buen vivir, which loosely translates as well-being. But it's a different conception of well-being and health that's related to nature and the belief system in that country. In parts of Africa, there's Ubuntu. So this isn't to say they replace Western medicine, but a lot of people will be accessing alternative health traditions and maybe trying to see where those connections are and whether there's any synergies as well. But maybe about kind of contextualizing some of these issues slightly differently in different cultures as well globally. So that's a kind of conversation that's just beginning really to emerge as an important issue to kind of address more fully. And this is a bit more of a very contentious point, more of a discussion point really. So in the health professions, so in public health, through the medical side of things, there's what we call a Hippocratic Oath. So anybody becoming a doctor in the UK has to take that Hippocratic Oath and promise not to do no harm. It's a very famous phrase, which you can Google, kind of reworded slightly. But we don't have that in built environment professions. We don't have to take that pledge. So we can still design environments that we know will cause harm to people. We can design cities that we know will contribute to poor health for the population. And there's calls for or questions about, do we need a Hippocratic Oath for built environment professions? And possibly as we move towards healthier, more livable cities, we might need to have a questioning of some of the ethics and values of urban planners and architects towards that. In the last section, it will explore a bit more about how maybe at the smaller scale, how architecture is beginning to respond to some of these. So there's more work on urban planning, and I guess we need to think through and integrate some of these. So this is an exploration of how this might occur at this scale. And it uses a health map. So it draws on directly from the work of Dahlgren and Whitehead, which has really been transformative for the public health sector. And it's addressing how that health map could be developed for the architecture profession. And in it, we have the same thing at the center as people, and then go through the different levels of thinking that an architecture profession or someone working in construction might need to think through. So materials, the environment, agency, and behaviors. And the next section goes through and explores that in a bit more detail. So the first level we get to is materials, kind of traditionally the bricks and mortar or the timber frame of which we're building. And the materials, obviously, have contribute a lot to the health of the user. There's a move particularly away from, say, petrochemical materials towards more natural materials. Partly there's claims or there's emerging debates about the toxicity of pathogens, allergens, and carcinogens. For example, I don't know whether you ever walked into a room that's been freshly painted or had a new an office with a new carpet laid down. The smell is quite intense, and often because it's got very high volatile organic compounds, and very high levels of that are related to things, so-called health issues as well. So partly it's about removing toxins from the environment, but also sustainability. Again, that connection between health and sustainability. So as the world moves away from petrochemicals, so as we move away from production of oil and use of oil to kind of renewable energies, we also will be breaking that link with the petrochemical, which is, plastics are basically quite cheap because of that. But when we stop removing so much oil, we'll also probably need to look towards new materials and different materials. And not least because of things like microplastics are an effect on the environment as well. So there's a real shift if we're expecting for the next kind of 10, 20 years in what we build out of as well, both for sustainability and for health. And this image talks to it. So on the right, as I look at it, there's very typical polystyrene, which is kind of a wonder material in some ways, but again, it comes from that source. There's potentially problematic. And a move made perhaps to things like lamb's wool, which is traditionally used in the UK. There's other materials as well, but possibly as a whole new industry needs to kind of gear up to address that, to produce enough material in time for the demand. And we know that traditional architecture is an example in Japan of the use of natural materials. So here we see timber frame building, very common globally. And also there's the tatami mat, which is a kind of straw or a kind of grass-like material that's been processed as well. And also a kind of connection to nature. But the many traditional architectures use natural materials, and we've kind of moved away from that, and possibly there's a reposition of moving back towards some of these approaches. There's also talk about the expression of those materials, so not just using natural materials, but trying to express their naturalness, if you will, again, can have big impacts on mental health as well, which we know is a kind of stressor as well. So there's a lot of research into exploring some of these issues as well. And they can be very innovative as well. So on the left is a roofing material that's just a naturally grown material using a very kind of contemporary way. We see lots of recycling. And at the bottom there is a material that's it's almost like a fungus or a mushroom that's processed and then is treated almost like a brick or a ceramic tile. It can be 3D printed as well. So we see lots of innovative use of natural materials, and things like 3D printing affording very, very innovative uses of technologies that maybe have never been historically possible as well. So there's a big potential of an exciting area to work in as well. The next level is about environments. So this is about how we design spaces, how we organize the building as well, how we can do that to help contribute to health. And obviously things like connection to greenery is really helpful. Where possible, natural daylight and natural ventilation can improve health. And also, again, simultaneously reduces things like the need for energy as well. Again, this is another example of that Japanese temple, or Japanese building, sorry. And we see the design there, obviously a really good connection to outside. It's a beautiful garden in this context. And we see that need, obviously, therefore, for connecting with urban planning and an architectural level. If that view was of a horrible road or a horrible urban environment, then the integration doesn't work. So we need to really think through all scales of the city, how architects can work with those. Again, if it was noisy and polluted outside, it won't work. So we need to really integrate the thinking across all these professions. And again, there's more of an opportunity. So this is about water outlets. So probably 99% of all buildings in the UK will just put that into a plastic downpipe. But these examples are about trying to celebrate nature, trying to celebrate waterfalling. So they're expressing the noise of that and the visual delight that can be in it. So there's real potential for cities to be more delightful places to be as well, which is about might be about sound and visual stimulation, which again can really contribute to health and well-being, sometimes subconsciously as well. And we can think about, might seem like a small thing, but planting as well. So we might plant to encourage bird song. So there's planting around a new hospital a relatively new hospital in the city, and they did think about planning so that, for example, when the wind blows, it moves through particular bushes and particular plants that make more sound, a kind of natural sound, to combat road noise, and planting trees with particular berries and fruits to bring birds in that will sing and make noise as well. So there's more, I guess, integration of some of those aspects. And also about restoration as well. So there's a real push towards what we call restorative architecture, restorative planning. So which isn't just about reducing health impact, but it's about that positive contribution to health, how you can actively restore health as well. And there's a number of ways you can do it. And one of the issues there is about sleep. So often it's kind of forgotten, but sleep quality is what we call a gateway to a number of health issues. So with poor sleep, and a huge proportion of the UK population has that, it's a gateway to other illnesses like obesity, heart disease, etc. So careful planning of cities, or better planning of integrated thinking about cities, we can reduce that gateway to lots of health issues. Again, there's great opportunities and lots of fun there that we can have to connect the design. So on the left is a building in Milan, which has been planted with more plants and biodiversity than the ground that it replaced. And obviously, lots of people across the city can enjoy that natural phenomenon. There's kind of courtyard buildings, a very popular tradition in some countries. And now the image at the bottom is what's touted as the greenest office in Europe, in Portugal. So again, a real possible changes to how we might think and conceive of these kind of spatial environments. And then, oddly enough, the forest school movement, which has come from some of the coldest and wettest countries in the world, and that's about questioning: do we even need so many of the buildings? Do we, so with forest schools, is rather than actually build the school, is just teach kids outside in forests and in green environments. And there's a push towards actually doing much more of the activities that we do outside in nature rather than inside. And I know that during COVID, there's been a big push to try and open the windows more and get people outside more, obviously in a socially distant way as well. So again, that's a real big questioning of some of the assumptions of the built environment, which I think we'll see unpicked more over the next few years. Agency, which is about comes from the kind of psychological term agency, about how people can have more control, ownership and empowerment by having greater control over the built environments, which can be an architectural, very simple, about being able to set the heatings at the level you want, or the ventilation, through to kind of city design and having an impact and say on how your city is developed. Here again, that same example is in Japan. Is the building is very flexible, so you can open it all up if you want to, or if you prefer for privacy or security, there are screens that can close down and really transform the interior. You can open and close privacy to outside. So high levels of control over your built environment can really improve levels of well-being and mental health. And we need to think about that at a city scale. So on the top left there is about an ideas workshop and co-designing, which we haven't talked about much, but bringing in the users, the end users, into the design process from an early stage and all the way through as well. So people who aren't built environment professionals, bringing them into that conversation, that creative process, so they have ownership of it, all the way through to once it's built and they can still have a say in that. At the bottom is a project here in Chile, where the architects have designed basically half of the housing and then left the other half for the users and clients to finish up as well. So it's a very different approach to our kind of halfway between architecture and urban planning, but allowing much greater level of control and agency by the end users and the end designers. And this is in Paris, so this was a wasteland, a derelict waste, unused part of the city. And in it, they've used kind of pallets and a temporary garden to grow allotments, and it's been used by the community to grow what they want. And it's also built up a little marketplace as well. So it's an opportunity for how, at a kind of urban design scale, almost, people can have quite direct say at building and constructing parts of the city. It's not the solution for everywhere, but for parts, it's part of the solution to create an increase in agency and empowerment. And the last section, moving towards the end of the presentation, is about behaviours. So this is about how to help reducing particularly things like sedentary lifestyles. We see things like increased use of staircases. How many hotels have we ever gone to where you're directed immediately to the elevator or escalator rather than to the stairs? So we want to kind of shift that, move back. And also try and question some of the, or promote things like social activity and livability. We see quite a real questioning of sitting all day long. I'm sure everybody at the committee and in this conference, probably, I would bet almost everybody sat and will be for maybe 7 or 8 hours today, which is very efficient, but really not very good for our health at all. We see in those images people beginning to question alternatives to sit. You know, we know that we need to work, and we're probably going to work on computers for the foreseeable future, more so than ever before during COVID. But sitting on our backsides all day long is definitely bad for us, bad for our posture, and contributes to a number of other kind of related and indirect health conditions. So we see people on those bouncy balls, kind of bouncy yoga balls, as a slightly different approach. This fun project where there's people standing and leaning in a number of different postures available, and then this fun project where people are sat in very different postures. So there's a big challenge. It's still really yet to be resolved about how we connect the use of laptops and the use of computers with posture, where we should really be moving around a lot more. So the built environments at the moment are really quite poor for that, and there's a lot to change with that. Tim Cook called it sitting is the new cancer, so really quite strong words there, but again, so it kind of reflects how important it is, I guess. And we know at a bigger scale how important the design is to whether we walk, whether we drive, etc., and sedentary lifestyle. Many developments now are designed that particularly the US model, where sometimes no opportunity to walk, there's no sidewalks, I guess Americans would call it, or footpaths at all in some developments. And many roads that you are not allowed, particularly in the UK, we have motorways where you're not allowed to walk at all, which would stop people from even being able to access parts of the city as well. And we need to build that out. I mean, at the moment, we're building in obesogenic environments. We're building in these health problems into the DNA of cities, and we need to really challenge those particularly. And the positive thing, we know that actually when we go from low density development that we see, just saw the image before, a higher density, we get a drop in the propensity for people to walk and drive less, and the increase of public transport, which also becomes more economically viable as well. So there's lots of evidence to support healthier and more sustainable development. And then actually we talked about Tim Cook. This example is really interesting because Apple, when they built their new headquarters, was one of the first companies in the world, one with an almost unlimited budget, to build what they said was the best building in the world. And they did that partly because, well, for a number of reasons, but also they know that their staff are so valuable that they want to keep them, and they want to keep them healthy as possible, because their most highly paid staff, if they're off for one day, it costs the company millions of pounds effectively. So they want to keep their staff as healthy as possible. And the relative cost of staff to the building is relatively low. So effectively, it was one of the first buildings where money was almost no option, problem, but they really wanted a building that keeps people not just healthy in a kind of absence of injury, but really that aspect of well-being, trying to get people happy, and the highest level of well-being possible. And they really did try and think through these issues. So it's a really good example of what can be achieved, I guess. And if we work through those levels, the materials, again, they quite deliberately chose natural materials, so things like maple and oak timbers, and then aluminium, so kind of and I deliberately move away from kind of plastics and petrochemical industry type of materials as well. So a very clear statement about the kinds of materials they wanted to use. And the next one was environment. So the whole thing was conceived about views of nature. So Steve Jobs said that he used to love it when he was working in London. He would walk out into Hyde Park, which is right in the middle of the city. When he had a problem he couldn't quite resolve, he liked to walk and talk, and often had walk and talk meetings. So this building was designed so that anybody, when they've got a problem, they could just walk straight out and walk through a kind of parkland setting to think through a problem and to walk and talk. So again, it's about that challenging sitting all day long, but also about connecting out to nature as well. So he's a great believer in the benefit of seeing nature. So everybody in the building pretty much can look out onto that. He also hated air conditioning. So the building, and for most of the year, is naturally ventilated, which is very, very rare for an American commercial development. So it has natural ventilation, as you can see, high levels of natural daylighting as well. So really thought through, particularly, a kind of gold star in terms of environmental design, I guess. In terms of agency, possibly that's its weak point. So probably a bit like an Apple phone or something that Apple like to take control rather than the user, possibly. So there's lower levels of individual user control in that environment. So probably could probably one of the weaker points, let's say. And then behaviours, obviously Tim Cook, sitting as a new councillor, he's really clear about changing behaviour, and Steve Jobs similarly loved to walk and talk. So there's much more use of kind of walking and staircases and behaviour, which also have the benefit of reducing energy as well, I guess. The building is designed, it's got this kind of donut or spaceship form, is about making it walkable so that you a kind of close proximity, a bit like the Pentagon, so that you can walk to other departments quite quickly, so that you can get from one side to the other. So again, trying to get people up and walking and talking, etc. Okay, so what have we learned from all of that? Obviously, it's a broad, holistic approach I took today rather than one individual project. And it kind of reflects on maybe over a decade of research into this area. And the changes that I've seen, particularly in from a kind of UK and EU perspective, is that the built environment professions, from urban planners, urban designers, architects, interior designers, and a range of others, can really play a significant role in improving human health. So when we look at the health problems there are, and the health problems we expect to see in the next few decades, we do have a major impact potentially in either exacerbating that or improving those conditions. But we need to connect them better. We're seeing that, maybe even 10 years ago it was relatively tentative, and now it's much stronger, but there's a long way to go and some really challenging questions as well. And particularly about the ethics as well. So the healthcare professions have very arguably different ethics and values to the built environment professions, and we possibly need to see a greater integration of those. And then lastly, although there is increasingly good evidence-based data, we need much more and much stronger to be able to make the case to decision makers, to policy makers, and to clients as users as well, as to why we're intervening in the built environment and why we need to make those changes to improve the health and well-being of that population. I'll let you finish there. Thank you very much. And for questions, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. It was an extremely thought-provoking keynote address, and so relevant in present contemporary times, particularly after a year of being confined related to public health issues. And now that we are coming out of the pandemic, it's probably all the more relevant today too. I would ask if anybody on the dais would like to add on to the thoughts of Lewis. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Louis Rice, and it is very informative in relation to the health and architecture and urban planning. I know that you are giving a very thought-provoking idea about this context in urban basically. But I'm looking at this health as an issue for rural areas and small towns, country like India. So this is also equally important. What do you think about that from the perspective of Indian population, mostly living in rural areas and small towns?
Oh, could you repeat the last bit? I couldn't quite hear what you said, the last sentence.
Louder.
The point is, I'm just trying to, understand that what is your opinion about the people living in rural areas, countryside, in Indian settlements, small towns, because we are trying to talk about the architecture and health in relation to urban area. It's quite interesting to see that they handle case studies and other interesting walkability and cycle tracks and everything. But majority of the population in India is more living in rural and small towns. So what do you think about how we can integrate the health and architecture and rural planning or something?
Thank you. Obviously, I don't know India that well. I've been there a few times. I loved it. I've visited a few times. I've visited it. I think it's a very interesting question because we see in the UK we see a lot. There's still a large rural parts of the population. Some very traditional, but also we're starting to see, particularly under COVID, a shift of people from urban conditions moving into rural areas as well. And also with COVID transforming the way we live, some people questioning whether we need cities, and lots of companies saying actually we can remove remotely. I think we're going to see even in India's rural communities a real change, I guess, with people not having to, make the move to cities and especially in the UK move out again from cities. So I think a lot of the issue, obviously, the perspective I take, or a lot of the knowledge I take, is from a kind of UK and EU perspective, where it's heavily urbanized. In the UK, we're about 90% urban. So in India, obviously, it's a higher proportion of rural areas. And I think, obviously, some of the decisions, things like walking and cycling, are relatively high levels in there. So I think what's key, I guess, is for each country and each area needs to think through the decisions for them. So some of the examples I've been given of kind of nature, obviously some parts of India are extraordinarily hot, almost desert-like, or certainly from my perspective, and some very lush as well. So walkability really changes, for example, in there. So I think we need to take some of these ideas and really contextualize it in those areas and use the locals' expertise to work out what can work best for those areas. Does that answer your question? I think we can move towards, providing healthy environments. I think we just need to think through, for each person living in each context, what are the health challenges and what are the health opportunities that can benefit that particular population. There'll be lots of similarities for each community, but it needs to be kind of tailor-made, a bit like a doctor would come and see you for your particular health care and then address that. So I think for each context, it'll need to be thought through for the particular kind of health profile of that individual or population, and then what can be done to improve that. Sorry, I can't. Yes, I can hear that.
Very inspiring keynote speech from your side, and especially when in your side, it is early in the morning and so much commitment. I am really really impressed with it. Okay, but you talked about natural materials and being in the nature, basically. When you're designing, and architects and builders and the planners, they have a lot of role to play here, and very inspiring thoughts, actually. And to be near to the nature and to have the natural views and to use the natural materials also, you said in your address. But sometimes you feel that, the timber and the stones, they're very, very limited. So how do we think of using those kind of natural materials? Because they are not, of course, timber or wood can be recyclable. You can have harvest with timber. But what about the stones and other kind of natural materials? How can you really survive upon the limited resources? So that is my question to you. How the architects can help themselves? Because in our side, in the hillside, slates are also there. quarrying of the stones is also banned. So in this context, I mean, how do we use natural materials? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So the some of these issues they're not going to be easy. They're not necessarily going to be possible tomorrow. But the questions that we need to be thinking about for the next 10, if we think about 2050 as the particular kind of climate change goal, we need to be kind of carbon neutral by then. So we need to start thinking now about transforming and moving away from, say, petrochemical, which will always form a part of what we need to do. For waterproofing, plastics, fantastic. So we need to start thinking about that. So for example, in the city I'm in Bristol, it's made a contribution to be kind of carbon neutral by 2030, and on the campus we're on, and we already know that we're aware that we don't know how to achieve that yet. So some of the targets are so difficult to achieve, we don't actually know what the solution is yet. But I think by setting out that target, it will force innovation, encourage innovation, experimentation to look towards, well, how do we do that? One of the examples I gave in that was of this a very innovative. So it's a kind of like a mushroom, I guess, originally, or a kind of fungus, and you can grow that in laboratory. Well, at the moment, it's in laboratory conditions, and you can grow that into whatever shape you want, and then fire it. So it's a bit like a ceramic or a terracotta or something. So that's a kind of organic material that's very easy to grow. It doesn't need any almost any kind of care whatsoever. So rather than maybe extracting minerals, we can find these very innovative ways of using nature and nature's capacity to grow. At the moment, some of these are very experimental, but just like, I guess, solar power and wind power 10, 20 years ago was seen as not really having, not going to be able to kind of scale up to meet the demands. We now see actually that, we can do it, and we are able to produce a huge proportion of energy through renewables. But 20 years ago, you would have been laughed at to say that the UK would mostly be powered on renewables, but now we are seeing that more. And I think with the choice of natural materials, or the move away from petrochemicals, we're going to have to do it anyway, as we disinvest from petrochemicals. Those materials aren't going to be available, and they're not going to be so cheap either, because they're cheap partly because we use so much oil, and it's just available. As we decarbonize the economy, we're going to have to do that, and we need to then also think through all of the supply chains about how to find new materials, and how to process biomaterials, or renew and reuse, recycle, and stuff like that. In the UK, you mentioned kind of stone and quarrying for materials. We see much more renewable of existing the buildings that we take down, we break up and reuse a lot more. So much less waste as part of that process as well. So we don't have all the answers at the moment, in short, but we need to be asking these questions now so that we can achieve, for example, sustainability targets and carbon neutral targets by the middle of this century. Probably not in the timescales. A colleague of mine said that he was doing a project at Cambridge University, and they said, oh, we want this building to be in oak. And he said, okay, well, you're going to need a lot of oak trees. And they said, oh, well, 200 years ago, we planted a forest of oaks, so they're just about ready now to cut down and build the building. And that's kind of quite, there's not many institutions that have a 200-year window within which they might design. But we probably need to start thinking a couple of decades or a long term, for how we're going to deliver these alternative materials or different ways of using those materials as well. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Dr. Louis, for your wonderful presentation today. Designing healthy and sustainable cities towards public health and architecture for well-being.
So I couldn't hear you then. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Hello.
Yeah,
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Just you have highlighted the key determinants of architecture like space ladder, quality of space, and the integration of the architecture and planning, and then integration of mental health care, environment, lifestyle, and human biology, new technology, and finally, with integration of urban planning and architecture is essential. That we agree. But I just want to know, and also energy minimization also you have highlighted based on the lifestyle, and we need to reduce the end-use energy consumption in order to contribute, in addition to the quality of space design. But in the physical planning aspect, I just want to know what is your opinion and what are the key determinant factors responsible for integrating public health, environment, and well-being, physical and mental well-being. That's what I just want to know. That is the need of the hour now in the physical planning aspects.
What was the last? What are the factors towards it? You say, sorry. What was the last sentence?
No, I just want to know what are the key determinants which are responsible for integrating environment, public health in the physical planning aspects.
Sure, thank you. I think we moving forward, if for nothing else, I think the economics of this are going to be driving this forward. So as we see, particularly with something like COVID, which is related to its connection of environmental design or environmental impacts, planning, architecture, and policy making as well. So we see how they're all those disciplines are connected. I think until relatively recently, the kind of cost of poor planning or unhealthy planning and unhealthy decision making within that, it was hard to track the cost on human health and on planetary health as well. I think as we move forward, I think we're going to see a lot more focus from economists and the financial planners about how to evidence and justify that integration as well. So I think, interestingly, that economists will probably play a much larger part than we have seen previously. Recently, there was a change in the measurement of gross domestic product towards trying to measure things like environmental sustainability, and we've seen things like happiness and well-being integrated into that. So rather than just pure economic totals, trying to connect some of these more subjective issues as well. So I think the economists and economic models, so when we design a new city or we retrofit a new city, I think, well, until even in the UK, we didn't have a cost projection of what that will mean in terms of extra load on the health services or the cost of ill health to that population. And I think actually we're beginning to see how governments, policymakers, planners, and clients are starting to change that dialogue. I think we've still got a long way to go, maybe, but I think actually the economics of this integrated, a more integrated approach we will see, and that will probably transform the kind of question of decision making as well, so that we know that if we choose an unhealthy city planning approach, somebody needs to pay for that further down the line. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Dr. Lewis.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the keynote address and very rich discussions at the start of the day. Thank you from all of us on the dais. From me personally, there were many takeaways from your presentation, and the highlight was where you mentioned that walkability is probably related to land use, diversity, intersection, density, and number of destinations. That really gives a way forward. We do work with these parameters in physical planning, but we don't actually have not linked it with walkability in terms of evidence. So this really actually shows a way for research. Thank you so much. And if you have time, do join in our technical sessions over the next 2 days, whenever you have time. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We will close the keynote session now, and I request all other attendees who have joined online to log in into the technical sessions, which will start in 5 minutes using the specific links. Thank you so much.